In 1969, Chrysler did something that would change American muscle car history forever. They took a 440 cubic inch V8, strapped three two-barrel carburetors to it, and created what would become known as the six-pack. It was brutal. It was beautiful. And within just a few years, it would be dead. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. This is the story of the Mopar 440 six-pack, and how an engine so dominant that competitors couldn't beat it on the track was ultimately killed by industry politics. Along the way, we'll encounter backroom deals, racing bans, insurance company conspiracies, and a lesson that every engineer eventually learns the hard way. Sometimes being the best isn't enough. So let's begin. But first, what exactly made this engine so special, and why were Chrysler's competitors so desperate to stop it? Now, to understand the six-pack, you have to understand the era it came from. The late 1960s were the golden age of American muscle. Every manufacturer, GM, Ford, Chrysler, was locked in an arms race to produce the most powerful street-legal machines ever built. Horsepower numbers were climbing every year, quarter-mile times were dropping, and the buying public couldn't get enough of it. Chrysler had been in this game since the beginning. Their 426 Hemi was already legendary, a purpose-built racing engine that had dominated NASCAR and drag strips across the country. But the Hemi had a problem. It was expensive, really expensive. The racing pedigree that made it so fast also made it complicated to manufacture, and that cost got passed directly to consumers. By the late 60s, a Hemi option could add over $1,000 to the price of a car, and that's in 1969 money. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking about the equivalent of adding $7,000 or $8,000 to your purchase today. For a lot of buyers, that was simply too much. So Chrysler needed something else, something that could deliver serious performance without the Hemi's price tag, something that regular people could actually afford. Enter the 440. The 440 cubic inch V8 had been around since 1966, primarily as Chrysler's big block engine for luxury cars and trucks. It was powerful, sure, but it wasn't really a performance engine. It was designed for torque and reliability, not racing. The standard version made around 350 horsepower with a 4-barrel carburetor. Respectable, but nothing that would scare a Hemi. But Chrysler's engineers saw potential. The 440's architecture was solid, its displacement was massive, and most importantly, its manufacturing costs were way lower than the Hemi's. If they could find a way to extract more power from this engine without fundamentally redesigning it, they'd have something special. The solution they came up with was elegantly simple: more carburetors. See, here's the thing about carburetors. A single 4-barrel carburetor can only flow so much air and fuel into an engine. At high RPM, when the engine is demanding maximum airflow, even a big 4-barrel becomes a bottleneck. The engine is essentially choking on its own appetite. One way to solve this is to use a bigger carburetor. But bigger carburetors have their own problems. They can be finicky at low speeds, hurt fuel economy, and make the car harder to drive in everyday conditions. Chrysler's solution was different. Instead of one big carburetor, they used 3 smaller ones. The center carburetor, a Holley 350 CFM 2-barrel, handled all normal driving. It provided smooth, predictable power for cruising, city driving, and light acceleration. But when you put your foot down, really put it down, 2 additional Holley 500 CFM 2-barrels would open up through a vacuum-operated linkage. Suddenly, the engine had access to 1,350 CFM of total airflow, more than most single 4-barrel setups could dream of. The result was an engine that could be docile and fuel-efficient when you needed it to be, and absolutely savage when you didn't. The 440 six-pack made 390 horsepower and 490 lb-ft of torque. Now, I should mention, those were the official numbers. The actual output was almost certainly higher. Manufacturers in this era routinely underrated their engines to keep insurance companies happy and to gain competitive advantages in racing classes based on horsepower ratings. Some historians estimate the true output was closer to 410 or even 420 horsepower, but the raw numbers only tell part of the story. What made the six-pack special was how it delivered that power. The triple carburetor setup gave the engine an incredibly broad power band. Unlike the Hemi, which really came alive at high RPM, the six-pack pulled hard from idle all the way to redline. It was tractable, drivable. You could take your wife to dinner and then demolish some kid in a Chevelle on the way home. And the sound. I mean, honestly, if you've never heard a six-pack at full throttle, you're missing out on one of the great automotive experiences. When those secondary carburetors opened up, the engine's tone would change completely, from a rumble to a roar. It was visceral, mechanical, unmistakably American. Chrysler debuted the 446-pack in 1969, offering it in the Dodge Super Bee and Plymouth Roadrunner. The option cost just $463, a fraction of what the Hemi cost. And while the six-pack gave away about 35 horsepower to the Hemi on paper, in real-world conditions the difference was often negligible. In some situations, the six-pack was actually faster because of its superior low-end torque and more forgiving power delivery. The market responded immediately. Sales were strong, magazine reviews were glowing, and on the street, six-pack cars were earning serious reputations. This was the muscle car that working-class buyers had been waiting for, Hemi-adjacent performance at a price they could actually manage. But here's where things start to get interesting, because Chrysler hadn't just built a great street engine. They'd built something that was about to cause serious problems on the racetrack. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question: where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, let's talk about what happened when the six-pack went racing. In the late 1960s, American motorsport was dominated by a few key sanctioning bodies. NASCAR handled stock car racing on ovals. NHRA and ASHRA governed drag racing. And the SCCA was starting to experiment with production-based road racing classes. Each organization had its own rules about what was legal and what wasn't, and those rules were about to become very important. The six-pack's combination of power, reliability, and affordability made it an obvious choice for racers on a budget. You could buy a Super Bee or Roadrunner, do some basic modifications, and show up at the track with a genuinely competitive car. The engine's broad power band meant it was forgiving of driver mistakes. Its simpler design meant it was easier to maintain than the Hemi. And its lower purchase price meant you had more money left over for upgrades. In drag racing, six-pack cars quickly became dominant in the classes where they were eligible. The engine's massive torque helped get power to the ground off the line, and its strong mid-range pull carried it through the quarter mile with devastating consistency. Guys who couldn't afford Hemis were suddenly running competitive times, and sometimes winning outright. Now this created a problem for Chrysler's competitors. Ford and GM had been investing heavily in their own performance programs. Ford had the 429 Cobra Jet and Boss engines. GM had the big block Chevys and Pontiacs. These were serious power plants with serious racing pedigrees. But the six-pack was embarrassing them, and doing it at a lower price point. The thing is, in racing, there are two ways to beat your competition. You can build a better car, or you can change the rules so their car isn't legal anymore. Guess which option proved more attractive? Through the late 1969 and into 1970 racing seasons, there were growing rumblings in the sanctioning bodies about the six-pack configuration. The arguments varied depending on who was making them. Some claimed that multiple carburetors created an unfair advantage. Others suggested that the setup wasn't truly stock. even though Chrysler was selling it to the public exactly as raced. Still others pointed to safety concerns, though exactly what was unsafe about 3 carburetors versus 1 was never really explained. What was actually happening, of course, was lobbying. Ford and GM had deep relationships with the sanctioning bodies. They had representatives on rules committees, they had advertising dollars that kept racing organizations funded, and they made it very clear that something needed to be done about Chrysler's dominance. This is where the story gets murky, because a lot of what happened next took place in private meetings and behind closed doors. But the outcome was unmistakable. One by one, racing organizations began implementing rules that either banned the six-pack configuration outright or placed it in classes where it couldn't compete effectively. Some required that cars run the same carburetor setup that was standard on the base model, which meant no six-pack cars since the standard 440 came with a single 4-barrel. Others created displacement penalties or weight additions, specifically targeting multi-carburetor setups. The effect was devastating. Cars that had been winning races one month were suddenly ineligible the next. Privateers who had invested their savings in six-pack builds found themselves with vehicles that couldn't compete. And Chrysler's racing advantage, built on engineering excellence, evaporated almost overnight. But the rule changes were only part of the story. Something else was happening simultaneously that would prove even more destructive. The insurance industry was taking notice. See, the late 1960s muscle car boom hadn't just caught the attention of enthusiasts and racers. Insurance companies had been watching too, and they didn't like what they saw. High-powered cars meant high-speed crashes. High-speed crashes meant expensive claims. And the actuarial tables were showing that young men buying muscle cars were getting into accidents at alarming rates. The insurance industry needed to do something to manage their risk, and they found a solution that was elegant in its simplicity: make the cars too expensive to insure. Starting around 1970, insurance companies began implementing dramatic rate increases for high-performance vehicles. A young buyer looking at a six-pack Super B might find that the insurance premium was higher than the car payment. In some cases, insurance for a muscle car cost more per year than a base-model sedan cost to buy outright. The insurance surcharges weren't random. They were specifically targeting horsepower, displacement, and, this is the key part, multi-carburetor setups. A 440 with a single 4-barrel might be rated one way. The exact same engine with 6 barrels would be rated significantly higher. The message was clear: exotic induction systems meant exotic insurance bills. Now, I should mention, there's debate among historians about whether this was a coordinated attack on the six-pack specifically, or just part of a broader industry response to muscle cars in general. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Insurance companies were definitely concerned about high-performance vehicles as a category, but the specific targeting of multi-carburetor setups suggests that someone, somewhere, was pointing them in a particular direction. What's undeniable is the effect. Sales of high-performance vehicles began to decline sharply. Young buyers, the core muscle car demographic, simply couldn't afford the insurance, and manufacturers started to get nervous about their entire performance-oriented product lines. Chrysler responded the only way they could. For the 1971 model year, they began detuning their engines. Compression ratios dropped, horsepower ratings fell. And the six-pack, which had been a defining feature of their performance lineup, started to seem like a liability rather than an asset. There was another factor at play too: emissions regulations. The Clean Air Act of 1970 was forcing manufacturers to completely rethink engine design. Lead was being phased out of gasoline, which meant compression ratios had to drop regardless of performance concerns. New limits on hydrocarbon and carbon monoxide emissions were making high-performance engines harder to certify. And the complex carburetor setups that made the six-pack work were particularly difficult to calibrate for emissions compliance. By 1971, the 446-pack was already a shadow of its former self. The advertised horsepower had dropped from 390 to 385, a small change that masked larger reductions in actual output due to different testing standards. The aggressive factory tune that had made the engine so responsive was softened to meet emissions requirements. And the market that had embraced the six-pack just 2 years earlier was evaporating under the weight of insurance costs and changing consumer preferences. The 1971 model year would be the last for the 446-pack in its original configuration. By 1972, Chrysler had abandoned the triple carburetor setup entirely. The 440 continued in various forms through the mid-1970s, but it was a different engine, strangled by emissions equipment, fed by increasingly sophisticated but less powerful fuel systems, optimized for efficiency rather than performance. And just like that, the six-pack era was over. Now, here's the thing that makes this story particularly frustrating for enthusiasts. The six-pack didn't die because it was flawed. It didn't die because something better came along. It died because it was too good. When you build something that dominates its competition, you become a target. Every rival, every governing body, every peripheral industry with a stake in the outcome, they all start looking for ways to bring you down. And in the automotive industry of the early 1970s, there were plenty of levers to pull. The racing bans ensured that the six-pack couldn't demonstrate its superiority in competition. The insurance surcharges made it prohibitively expensive for ordinary buyers, and the emissions regulations provided a convenient technical excuse to discontinue the configuration entirely. Was it a conspiracy? That's a strong word. But it was certainly a confluence of interests that all happened to point in the same direction, away from Chrysler's dominance and toward a more level playing field that favored the established order. The engineers who designed the six-pack had done everything right. They'd created an engine that was powerful, reliable, affordable, and practical. They'd solved the eternal muscle car problem of making something that was fast on the track and livable on the street. They'd given ordinary buyers access to performance that had previously been reserved for the wealthy few. And none of it mattered. Because in the end, politics beat engineering. It almost always does. What happened to the people behind the six-pack? The engineers mostly stayed at Chrysler, working on increasingly emissions-constrained designs through the 1970s. Some left the industry entirely, frustrated by the regulatory environment. A few found their way to the emerging aftermarket performance industry, where the six-pack configuration would live on in modified form for decades. The cars themselves became instant collectibles. As soon as production ended, enthusiasts recognized that something special had been lost. Surviving six-pack cars were preserved, restored, and celebrated. Today, a numbers matching 1970 446-pack Super Bee or Roadrunner commands serious money at auction, a testament to the engine's enduring reputation. And what of Chrysler? The company never quite recaptured its muscle car glory. The oil crisis of 1973 killed whatever was left of the performance market. Chrysler would face near bankruptcy in the late 1970s and again in the 2000s. The bold engineering culture that had produced the Hemi and the six-pack gave way to cost-cutting and conservatism. But the legend survived. Ask any muscle car enthusiast about the 446-pack, and you'll hear the same thing. It was one of the great ones, maybe the great one when you factor in price and practicality. An engine that proved what American engineers could do when they were allowed to do their best work. The tragedy is that they weren't allowed to do it for very long, so there you have it. The story of an engine that won on merit and lost on politics. A reminder that excellence is no protection against a system that wants you gone, and a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks that building the best product is enough to guarantee success. The 446-pack deserved better. But then, a lot of things do. And that is the story of the Mopar 446 pack. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments. Had you heard of this engine before? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.